So today's short on my part was not supposed to be made. In fact, it was supposed to be a fully fleshed episode. It was supposed to be episode 5 that we are currently revising for Real Talk with Shan and Bilal, our fully fleshed podcast on Charlottesville. But that did not happen because we felt like it was an outdated topic for the most part. So we decided to move on, and we are going to cover something. We don't even know what we're going to cover at this point, so stay tuned for that. Instead, I'm going to make what was supposed to be a fully fleshed segment on Charlottesville into my personal opinion about the debate on Confederate statues in this country. Now, in addition to that, we were also going to talk about the actions between the KKK neo-Nazi white supremacists on the right who organized the Unite the Right movement and the people on the left, the Antifa people, but we feel like we adequately covered that, at least in the aspect of Antifa, in our second episode when we talked about the ongoing protests with the Trump administration and against white supremacy in this country as a whole. So we didn't think that we needed to cover that again, and thus we completely scrapped the idea of covering Charlottesville because we thought it was redundant. So today I am going to talk about my stance on Confederate issues. So personally speaking, before I get into any facts or any articles that I'm going to cite, I personally don't think that they belong in the public domain. I think they glorify Confederate soldiers, and I think people make a huge misconception over the glorification of Confederate soldiers and commemoration to Confederate soldiers. Because I believe people who are commemorated through statues are really glorified, because you wouldn't have a statue of Adolf Hitler, who's a part of Germany's history, in Germany, because he was an evil person who killed millions and millions of people in Germany. But just because he is one of the most prominent parts of modern German history doesn't mean that they should commemorate to his history with a statue. And in the same way, Confederate soldiers who fought to preserve an institution, for the most part, I know that the Civil War was not only about slavery, but it was mostly about slavery. It was the institution that the people who sympathized with it on the South wanted it to grow as Manifest Destiny and the spread to the West continued for the United States. The people who believed in this institution are being glorified through these statues, effectively, and in a multicultural society that we live in today, I don't believe that it is the most effective choice to glorify them through the construction of statues. And before I was saying that the Civil War was not only about slavery but also about states' rights, well, the two pieces of legislation that mainly caused the Civil War, apart from the election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln was elected president as an abolitionist candidate, something that the southern states did not approve of. Before that, protective tariffs of 1828 and 1832, also called the Tariff of Abominations, by state legislatures such as South Carolina's, led by John Calhoun, who was one of the vice presidents of the United States. I don't remember which one. These are the legislations that basically crippled the Southern economy in trying to basically protect Northern manufacturing industries, because it basically made the doctrine that protectionism for Northern manufacturing, which produced most of the industrial economy for the entirety of the United States, was to be preserved, and thus the Southern agricultural economy, which was mainly fueled by slaves in plantations, was compromised, and thus the first steps towards abolition was kind of being perpetuated, and that really worried a lot of people in the South who wanted to preserve the institution for economic purposes, because slavery was essentially a means of economic growth in agriculture for the South. So I believe that the public, instead of taking matters into their own hands and removing statues themselves, should instead petition to remove the statues if they feel strongly about this issue, which they definitely do. I mean, 12% of this country in the modern day, as of now, as of the 2010 census, I believe, is 12% African Americans throughout the entirety of this country, especially in the coastal areas and the South, because obviously of ancestral background. So there is definitely a sentimental purpose towards the removal of these statues that glorify the people who basically tortured the ancestors of the people living in this country today. And in petitioning, they should contact their mayor, their state legislature, their state assembly, their municipal government, before going to the federal government, or before even taking matters into their own hands, like I said. And peaceful petition here, not only is it protected by the First Amendment, and an arson is not, and taking matters into your own hands, such as the removal of statues through public brute force is also not protected by our First Amendment, and it is in fact illegal. The peaceful petition to remove these statues is. And the fact that people think that this is not the right thing to do, or it's an ineffective thing to do, and people should take matters into their own hands and take these statues down themselves because governments aren't going to do anything in the name of appeasement of conservatives, is absolutely not true. Take the example of Baltimore mayor mayor, Catherine Pugh, who had statues removed from Baltimore. And she said it was in the best interest of her city to avoid events and the public backlash, which was basically ignited by the far right individuals in Charlottesville, because the mayor of Charlottesville, I believe, had already pitched of taking it down days before he was going to attempt to take it down. He did it, and he gave the right enough of a platform and enough time for them to unite, as they did eventually, and basically gather in front of the statue to try to prevent them from taking it down. So Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh took it down in midnight so that the events of Charlottesville weren't encapsulated by this place in Baltimore. They removed the Robert E. Lee statue and the Thomas Stonewall Jackson monument, these two monuments in Baltimore. And this didn't even take a petition to do. She did this in the best interest of her city after the events of Charlottesville. She saw it as her social responsibility, and the responsibility in lieu of the climate of the country, the poisonous climate between the far left and the far right, which culminated in the events of Charlottesville. That caused her to take these statues down in midnight so that the same controversies would not arise as a result of what happened in Charlottesville. And I completely get the case of not having these statues in the public domain. Like I said before, I think the first point I made in this video was that I do not believe that they belong in the public domain. Instead, I think in the least that they do belong in Confederate museums. These Confederate monuments belong in museums because that's the perfect way to basically preserve history. You have to have a plaque underneath saying who this person was, when it was built, whether it was built after the Civil War or before the Civil War, whether it was built in the 1960s in response to the Civil Rights Movement in order to show African Americans their so-called, in air quotes, place in this country, rather than them being commemorative monuments just as a harrowing reminder, as a chilling reminder to African Americans. That's the best way to preserve history, rather than paint all of these statues as post-Civil War monuments commemorating two soldiers in the South in the Southern effort to try and preserve states' rights from eventual federal government tyranny, which was not completely the case, as they were trying to also uphold the institution of slavery. And I do believe it is a form of taxation without representation if you are forced to give, no matter how small the percentage might be, a percentage of your taxable income, of your tax, to the state government, at least. That should be I don't believe that it should be going to these Confederate monuments, especially if the general majority of the population of these cities believe that they should be taken down. Because if you don't want something up, but you're indirectly paying for that thing being maintained, especially in your constituency, then that is definitely taxation without representation to me. And this can only be addressed by peaceful petition to state assemblies and municipal governments, not by arson or not by taking these statues down by oneself. And on a finishing note, I do believe that a lot of criticisms of the mayor, Mayor Pugh, is that when does this stop? I think President Trump said this right after Charlottesville as well, after many people called for statues of George Washington, our first president, and our second president, Thomas Jefferson, statues to be taken down as well, because they're former slave owners in addition to being former presidents. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, never mind that Thomas Jefferson is one of the first people who spoke out against the institution of slavery, calling it a hideous blot on the face of this country. But the fact that they didn't legislate on it is why people believe that their statues should also be taken down, which I completely disagree with. And President Trump, like I was saying before, he said, when does this stop? And I do believe this is where it stops, because these are the people who led the movement in order to fight perceived government tyranny in the North and preserve states' rights in the South and protect the institution of slavery and lead to its spread through the West as the United States was expanding. And I want to finish off on one final note. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, the person whose statues are at the center of this entire controversy, once said that basically, I don't remember the entire quote, I don't have it in front of me either, but he basically said that statues like his that are erected all over the East Coast are a harrowing reminder of the country's violent past, and people who are emulated in those statues, such as himself, Thomas Stonewall Jackson as well, especially during wartime, they reopen deep wounds that many people in this country have. And I tend to agree with that, although I don't believe that in this day and age that should be the leading moral consensus, because that would also exacerbate tensions on the right, who believe that it is a part of the country's history. I don't think they should be taken down. I think at the least they should be moved away from the public domain, because that's not where they belong, taxpayer funded. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to this short. We will be back with episode 5 sometime this week, I hope. I am Shan, and goodbye.